As Librarian of Congress, it's my pleasure to welcome you all here today for this very important symposium on Jack Kemp and the Reagan Revolutionaries in the House. My job is to introduce it and then get out of the way so the distinguished panel behind me can get on with this important program. It's sponsored by the Jack Kemp Foundation and the Kluge Center of the Library of Congress, and led by the first Jack Kemp scholar in political economy at the Library of Congress, Morton Kondracki, or Morton, as I remember he used to be sometimes referred to. I won't, in the presence of this distinguished and experienced panel and audience, I'm not going to attempt to encapsulate the extraordinary, versatile career of Jack Kemp. I do want to especially welcome Joanne Kemp, his great wife and longtime companion, to be here with us, an inspirational person in her own right. And I will shortly turn it over to Jeff Kemp, who will be in charge of moving on with the program. Let me just say that as a football player, as a 9-term member of the House, as a cabinet member, as a vice presidential candidate, as an inspirational speaker, as a man who was enraptured with the American idea, communicated his enthusiasm, helped us learn about enterprise zones, so much else. It's a great pleasure and honor for the Library of Congress to be not merely welcoming this attention by a remarkable group of panelists of one of our important and consequential figures in American life. Also an inspirational speaker to so many and a tremendous enthusiast. Just one example. I don't recall anybody more enthused about a project we once had here at the library, to have an exhibit of Winston Churchill. Without his enthusiasm, that exhibit never would have taken place, and we would have never discovered the 17 letters of Winston Churchill that we had in the Library of Congress all along. But until his enthusiasm wore off on all of our curators, we didn't discover those 17 letters that described his experience as, in fact, as a trench warrior in the Army after his defeat at Gallipoli. So Jack Kemp has been a historical figure who's helped enrich history and enrich the very neglected side of our history, which David McCullough pointed out at the joint session of Congress, the 200th anniversary of the Constitution, when he pointed out how little attention has been paid on a national scale to the history of the Congress. So with the experimental nature of the Kluge Center, we are very fortunate that the Jack Kemp Foundation has enabled us to have this important testimony of oral history. Congress willed and ordained that we have a Veterans History Project, which is now the largest oral history project in American history. And so we're pleased that the head of our manuscript section, Jim Hudson, is here. The head of the Kluge Center, Carolyn Brown, is here. The Kemp Project at the library has two elements: the Jack Kemp Collection in the Manuscript Division and the Jack Kemp Chair in Political Economy in the Kluge Center. The Kemp Chair in Political Economy is intended to advance the study of political economy, as its name implies, and to enable original research based in part on the rich variety of issues and opinions and inspiration that Jack Kemp gave, and the collection has been very importantly and generously conferred on the library, and it's our pleasure and our honor to have it. So it was initiated by a gift from the Jack Kemp Foundation, and the first scholar is Morton Kondracki, the inspiration behind today's event, who is writing a book about Jack Kemp's congressional career and his leadership in so many ways. He's particularly well qualified for this work, having covered all phases of American politics and foreign policy as both a print and broadcast journalist. He recently retired after 20 years as executive editor for the Capitol Hill newspaper Roll Call from 1977 to 1991. He was executive editor of the New Republic his list of accomplishments is almost as broad in his field as Jack Kemp's was in so many. So anyhow, this symposium brings together key colleagues who lived and molded events during the Reagan years. It's kind of a unique gathering of very important and consequential figures in their own right who came together around and in the recollections and reflections on Jack Kemp's life and career. This will inform Mort's research here in the library, as well as create a record for future researchers who will be able to consult it. So we're very glad to welcome all here in the presence of Stradivarius music. For a little, the strings are silent, but the strings of memory are very rich here. So it's a great pleasure to turn the proceedings over to the next generation of Kemps. Jeff Kemp, himself a quarterback and a perpetuator of the Jack Kemp legacy, to introduce the program. So thank you very much, Jeff, and the foundation.
Thank you, Dr. Billington. It's great to see everyone here. On behalf of the Kemp family, the Jack Kemp Foundation Board of Directors, and its president, my brother Jimmy Kemp, who today is in San Antonio with Henry Cisneros holding the Jack Kemp Symposium on Housing. Appropriate that the Reagan Revolution and this application to housing and empowerment would be happening at the same time. Thus, Dad, I guess, had foresight with Mom to have two sons, so one of us could be each place today. And we're grateful for the partnership, particularly with the Library of Congress, where the Kemp scholar resides, Mort Kondracki. We're impressed and looking forward to all the work that he's been doing at the Library of Congress with the Kluge Center during this Kemp Legacy Project. This project today is aligned with it, but not exactly the same thing. This is the Kemp Oral History Project. And we look forward to the fabulous discussion that will ensue about the Reagan Revolution, the ideas that are applicable today and going forward, which is what Dad's passion was, that we take the best of the past and we apply it to the present and the situations of the future. The Oral History Project has been excellent so far. I think Mort has interviewed 36 different leaders among the 60 that he eventually will. He's talked to Bill Bradley and Vice President Cheney and many others, including some of the esteemed gentlemen with us today at this panel. The relationship with the Library of Congress is one that we're very honored to be in association with. We thank you, Dr. Billington, Dr. Hudson, Carolyn Brown, and we're really looking forward to all the work that Mort is doing as the scholar, and to see these ideas, the American ideas that Dad called them, the American idea, stewarded well, crafted well for the future, and then advanced to reach as many people as we can so this country can maintain and build upon its great heritage. I think I'd just like to summarize what I'm hoping to see from all of this in 3 words. And the 3 words would be, number one, the one that Dr. Billington used, enthusiasm. That there be enthusiasm for great ideas, enthusiasm for this great nation, and enthusiasm for people, which is why we have such a great nation and what these ideas serve. They give people the potential to be all that they were meant to be, and that meant so much to Dad. The second word is growth, and we know that that's what the Reagan Revolution was about. It's what our nation needs today, and it's what the world needs. Obviously, fiscal discipline combined with entrepreneurial systems that lead to growth and give people the potential to reach their highest and best. And the last word is one that came from Secretary Bill Bennett, who summed up Dad's life by the word lift. And as we delve into the history and the ideas, we look forward to using all of those in the spirit of lift, that lifts other people and isn't about ourselves or our own interests. So on behalf of the Kemp family and the Jack Kemp Foundation Board of Directors, we're very thankful to the Library of Congress and Dr. Billington, and look forward to this program with you, Mort, and with your esteemed partners up here. So thank you. Let's enjoy a great day together.
Thank you so much, Jeff and Dr. Billington, and thank you, Reagan Revolutionaries, for all being here, and those who covered them. So let me introduce the panel first, and then we're going to have a video to set off. On the far end there is Bob Walker.
former congressman from Pennsylvania who served with Jack from 1976 until Jack's career, House career at least, was over in, at the beginning of 1989. Next is Vin Weber, who served from 1980 to 92. Next is former Congressman and Senator Connie Mack, who was in the House with Jack from 1982 to 1988. Bob Livingston, who was here in Congress from 1977 to 1998, and with Jack from 77 to 88. At the far end is current Congressman Dan Lundgren, has done 2 tours in Congress and was here from 79 to 88 with Jack. Alan Riskin, who is the editor of Human Events, a major conservative publication, and my partner in crime here, Fred Barnes, the former of the Baltimore Sun, later the New Republic, now the Weekly Standard and Fox News. Before we begin the discussion, we're going to play a video that comes from Ronald Reagan's tribute to Jack Kemp when he left the Congress.
A man who, when the clock struck high noon, is always at my side, is leaving office this year. He helped to settle a tough frontier, the Congress, loading a 6-gun with solid gold bullets. But above all, Jack Kemp is a man of ideas, and I think really it is those ideas that brought most of you here tonight, and it's on that basis that we should praise him. Certainly he's held high office, and yes, from the gridiron to the political field of battle, Jack is a man of action and a man of courage. But the largeness of this quarterback is his sweeping vision of human freedom, profound in its depth, majestic in its reach. Back in the 1970s in Washington, our ideas were relegated to the fringe. Prevailing economic wisdom took it as a given that the federal government could manage the economy to success, while the conservative vision of government and political economy barely had a foothold in Washington. And then Jack Kemp came on the field. Working with a small group of maverick economic thinkers, Jack began to read economic history and arcane studies of tax and monetary policy. He learned of the effect of the tax cuts under Presidents Coolidge and Kennedy, and he listened to the working people of his congressional district in northern New York. So while the Beltway crowd despaired of ever reforming the tax code, even as my predecessor in the White House called it a disgrace to the human race, there were nonetheless a visionary few who were undaunted. In 1977, Jack put forward the Kemp Roth bill to cut personal income tax rates 30% across the board. Still, the reigning orthodoxy held firm to its prescription of high taxes and easy money, and even as the stagflation soared. But other thinkers replied that the solution was just the opposite. Low taxes and stable money. And after our administration took office and we implemented those policies, the result was just as promised. High rates of economic growth with low inflation. Jack's fond of saying that this administration gave America back its future. Well, if I can return the compliment, Jack, I would just like to say that your ideas help fuel us to go further into the future than we ever dreamed possible. So to you, and to Joanne and your wonderful family, that is so much a reflection of your love and spirit. You have our gratitude. And come January, when I saddle up and ride off into the sunset, it'll be with the knowledge that we've done great things. We kept faith with a promise as old as this land we love and as big as the sky. A brilliant vision of America as a shining city on a hill. Thanks to all of you, and with God's help, America's greatest chapter is still to be written, for the best is yet to come. Thank you all, and God bless you.
Well, I don't know that anybody can do better than that, but let me start by asking each of you a couple of questions, beginning with Bob Walker. So how would each of you characterize Jack Kemp's role in the Reagan Revolution, and what difference did it make for American conservatism? Bob Walker.
Well, certainly Jack was the idea foundation for the economic program that Ronald Reagan put forward. It was Jack who drove that agenda. There were a relative handful of us who, in the early days of the Reagan campaign, back in the period of time around 1978, who came on board, and Jack was one of those. And Jack came on board with a lot of ideas at that point to try to focus Reagan on the idea of growth economics. And as a result, the Reagan administration economic policies, I think, were a major success because of Jack's enthusiasm and his intellectual capacity.
Ben?
Yeah, I think there were really three main areas of issues that Reagan ran on. One was growth economics, another was obviously winning the Cold War, national defense. And the third, which is a little harder to define, was a different approach to social policy. And in all three of those areas, Jack, in my view, was really the preeminent leader in the Congress and in the country in helping to both educate and popularize those ideas. He gets most attention, of course, for supply-side economics, which is understandable, because even when I came into Congress, I would say that those of us that really believed in that were in the minority, even in our own party, I think. I still remember, maybe Dan Lund remembers, still remember Barbara Conable was the ranking member on the Ways and Means Committee, and he carried the bill. And I remember, and Kent Hance, a Democrat, was the Democrat co-sponsor of the bill. And I remember when Barbara Conable got up and introduced the next speaker, his partner in crime on this measure, Kent Hance. And I thought, I think Barbara kind of really believes that. Because it was, economic orthodoxy was, you need to worry about the deficit first, and this notion of reducing tax rates to spur growth is still not proven, even though, as Jack had pointed out, and as President Reagan pointed out in the clip we just saw, you could go back a long ways in history and show that it worked out for Coolidge and Kennedy. It still was not what most people in our party believed, but Jack did, and Jack carried the conference along and carried the country along on supply-side economics. But I think you also have to talk about winning the Cold War, which was also a controversial topic. We have a hard time believing that now, that winning the Cold War it was ever a controversial topic, but it really was. We were thinking about how to maintain sort of the balance of terror, but the notion that we could ever win the Cold War was unthinkable. Jack was also a leader in that. And then the third zone, which I think deserves a lot of attention, was social policy, domestic policy, a little less defined and frankly of less interest to the Republican Party, still to today of less interest to the Republican Party, and not as big in any of our lives as supply-side economics or winning the Cold War. But Jack was always the guy in front trying to talk about ways to approach the problems of the inner city, trying to figure out ways to reform education, housing later on. And that whole zone of policies, which even to this day are still owned pretty much by the Democratic Party.
Connie Mack?
Well, let's see, my involvement began in '82. So I was not in the Congress when the bill was passed. But the influence that Jack had was way beyond what was taking place on the floor of the House or the Senate. And I think I'm right about this, that he wrote a book called American Renaissance, which I was reading as a candidate for office in probably late 1981 and 82. And so I think the element that I think of when I think about Jack, and Vin is so right in all these different areas that Jack had influence. But the thing that struck me the most was the absolute conviction that he brought to the discussion of the ideas, the power of his personality. As a new member of the Congress in 1982, it wasn't long before you knew who was the leader. When Jack walked on the floor and asked you why you voted a certain way, he was determined that he was going to educate you about the importance of growth, low taxes, sound money, a strong national defense, and the expansion of freedom throughout the world. So for me, he was a true mentor, a true educator. So those are the thoughts that I have, again, for a fellow that wasn't actually there when the bill was passed.
Well, I have to agree with what everybody said. He was a mentor to me as well. I ran first in '76 and lost, and the guy that beat me was nice enough to go to prison, and I had another shot at it. And I got in a special election in '77, and Jack had been writing in that process, and I had read a lot of his stuff and was using it on the campaign trail just as Connie did subsequently. And it helped me. But I didn't really get to know Jack other than to read his stuff and to observe him on the floor and to watch his rhetoric transform the Reagan campaign into one that propelled him into the presidency. But I got to know him on a personal basis because of his efforts and Ronald Reagan's landslide in 1980. I got transferred unwillingly at first to the Appropriations Committee, and worked with Jack during those formative years of my career on appropriations on the same subcommittees, particularly foreign operations. And I got to know him personally and work with him and understand his ranting and raving about the internet, the multilateral organizations, XM, the internet, IMF, hear about the gold standard. But I also got to appreciate his keen proselytizing demand for respect for individual liberties and for civil rights. Through him, I got to know Ernie Ladd and Roosevelt Greer, guys he had played football with, who loved the guy because he was one of the few outstanding players in the NFL and in football who stood up for equal opportunity, equal rights for minorities in football and beyond. And he took that with him. And so I guess I just came to appreciate so many facets of Jack's career and his personality that I look back at the praise that Ronald Reagan bestowed on him and say that was probably more eloquent than any of us can attribute, but it may have been understated.
Yeah, that was the poetry, this is the prose. Okay, Dan Lundgren.
Well, if I were to use a scriptural reference, Jack was the John the Baptist of the conservative movement. Ronald Reagan was the one who made us capable of being able to actually have the conservative movement and ended up in changing America and ultimately changing the world. Jack was there before Ronald Reagan was in Washington, D.C. Jack had the power of his ideas. One of the things I was thinking of is there's an expression that someone leaves you breathless. Someone comes into a room and takes all the oxygen away. Jack was just the opposite. Jack came in and he gave you all this oxygen. You talk about him being larger than life. In a sense, he was, because he came in and you immediately were attracted to him, but it didn't detract from who you were. It built you up. You know, it's like in somebody who's a very good player in football or basketball. You talk about the playmaker making everyone else around him better. I always felt Jack did that with all of us. For those of us who formed the Conservative Opportunity Society, a little rump group of I would call us progressive agitators, constructive critics, Jack was our lifeline to the leadership. We were able to do certain things that perhaps we wouldn't have otherwise been able to do because Jack was able to talk to the leadership and explain that we actually had a reason for what we were doing. We weren't just agitating, we were agitating to change things. I remember seeing Jack at Knott's Berry Farm when he was on his bus tour for Kemp Roth. And that was exciting in that atmosphere to see him. You come back here and it was exciting to see him. Occasionally we'd have to remind Jack that we weren't in a huddle and he wasn't a quarterback and maybe he should listen to us. And he took it well, particularly if we ever used the name of Joanne, because that was one person he responded to. And I'm reminded of all the things we talked about, there was a specific foreign affairs aspect that Jack took personally, and Joanne joined him in that, and that was the cause of Soviet Jewry. There was a constant, persistent, effective campaign on behalf of those who were being persecuted for no other reason than they wished to engage in their religion in some meaningful way. And Jack would be on the floor talking about that. Joanne led groups of spouses here, reading the names of those who were behind the Iron Curtain and being persecuted because of their faith. I think one of the things, Jack made it cool to be conservative. I mean, it wasn't the green eye shade, rigid Republicans of the past. Jack was this guy who embraced people. I don't think Jack ever met someone who he didn't like. I'm sure there's some people who didn't like him for some reason. But that would have just been a challenge to Jack to make him a friend and ultimately convert him to the gold standard. That's a little inside joke there. But I mean, he transformed the party by giving us energy, not taking energy away, and making it okay for us to appeal to people we hadn't appealed to in a very, very effective way. He was able to touch people's hearts and speak to them where it really mattered, and he helped us convey our message in that way. He was substance and he was message. And I mean, I'm privileged in my lifetime to have been here with Ronald Reagan and with Jack Kemp.
Alan?
Could I just
Yeah, sure.
add back to the kind of the central point of your question, I think, was conservatism, what effect did he have? And I think what we all have collectively been saying is that he brought to the table a series of new ideas and new approaches to solve problems, whether it was empowerment or enterprise zones, the whole notion of lower tax rates, not lower taxes, but lower tax rates. But he gave us a whole series of different ideas to solve problems, which enabled us to be able to go to speak to people who we never were able to reach out to before. And I remember going back with some pride, telling Jack that I had spoken to the not the NCAA, to speak to the African American community in my hometown about ways that we as Republicans and conservatives could change their lives and give them a future and give them hope. So we've talked about enthusiasm, but the ideas, and as Dan said, he kind of made it cool for us. We could go talk to people that we were not comfortable talking to prior to that, and I think that was a huge gift that he gave us.
Okay, I want to let Alan and Fred reflect.
Well, I will give a little bit about, because I thought actually, I'm with Human Events, editor of Human Events, and Human Events was, we preached to a lot of conservatives, 80,000 I think we had subscribers at one point, and Mort, you said not to be hero worship. You didn't want us to hero. Everyone here is worshiping Jack, and I myself worship Jack. And I remember when he came in 1970, we followed him religiously. We portrayed him, in Human Events as again, everyone here has talked about it. But I mean, he was good on everything, on foreign. I mean, so far as we were concerned, foreign policy, defense, obviously economics, and I want to say that in my view, he has been underappreciated as somebody, because, I'll tell you why, is because of the liberal community. In the liberal community, when Jack died, the idea is they thought that I think they viewed him as the only Republican, white Republican, who liked blacks. That's why they liked him. And they talked about empowerment zones, and they talked about his civil rights views, but they never gave him credit for what I think is key to not only our economic health, but winning the Cold War, which had to do with supply side economics. And the fact is that Kemp Roth was in my view, was not only something that was important for Republicans, and he persuaded the House Republicans, but more important, he persuaded Ronald Reagan. And that's what makes him such an historic figure, in my view, because as a result of supply-side economics, we had this, we restored our economy, we had a booming economy, and Gorbachev saw that, and it seems to me that when it came to ending the Cold War, my own view is that it has to do with the Reykjavik. At Reykjavik, Reagan decided not to give up the Strategic Defense Initiative, and I believe at that time, I'm not just speculating, in other words, I've seen this, is that Gorbachev, white flag of surrender, because he felt he couldn't compete with us economically, and that was obviously Kemp Roth, and he felt he couldn't compete with us militarily because Gorbachev felt that there was no way that he could match us militarily because they were in such dire straits economically. And I think Ronald Reagan was, in my view, he was one of the great presidents, and he was one of the great presidents because of what the first thing I talked about, obviously economics, and we know about the growth and restoring American economy. Secondly, he won the Cold War, and Americans did not die when he won the Cold War. We didn't have a large amount of casualties as a result of that. And I believe that it was Reaganomics, and based on what Jack Kemp did, that was key to that victory. And I feel that to the extent that Ronald Reagan was great, I feel that Jack actually gave an enormous contribution to that. And I think without him, it's not even clear that we would have, that Reagan would have actually embraced supply-side economics. I have one more point here to say about this, is that one thing to say is that when Kemp gave his speech before in Miami, I think it was in June or July of 1979, Jack told me, it was before union officials, and Jack told me that Reagan, because of human events, we reprinted it, and the fact is, Jack told me that as a result of all the stuff that we had said about Jack in the past and publicizing supply-side economics and all of that, he felt, and Reagan read us religiously, as people knew, and so therefore he felt that that particular speech of his was key to Reagan's adopting supply-side economics. And the fact is that in August, Marty Anderson then came out with a plan for Reagan about what his economic plan was, and it was based entirely on Kemp Roth. And as a result of that, and Reagan, when he actually announced for the presidency, talked about Jack Kemp being one of his top economic planners. So it's key, anyway, the point is that it was Jack Kemp that was instrumental in both our economic recovery and in also winning the Cold War.
Fred. Very good.
But I'm not hero worship. There's no hero worship here.
I first met Jack Kemp in 1981. I was a reporter for the Baltimore Sun, a paper that was once very influential, but at least not when I was there. And so Jack had no real reason to pay attention to me, but I did not know what supply-side economics was. And I certainly, all I knew that it was a phrase, and it was something that Jack Kemp talked about and Ronald Reagan had adopted, and so I decided I'd write a piece for the Baltimore Sun about it, and got a hold of Kemp's congressional office, and they said, well, why don't you come on this one-day trip with Jack back to Buffalo? So I said, fine, and we flew together on a private plane up to Buffalo. Jack talked the whole time. I don't think I asked a question, but he talked the whole time. It all came up, supply-side economics, tax cuts, the gold standard, and so on. And Jack was, I'll have to say, for me, a young reporter, overpowering, a force of nature. And here he, obviously I was not would not be a strategic ally of his, but he was in the full convert me mode that Congressman Lundgren talked about. I have no idea where we went in Buffalo that day, but he had some events, and then we flew back. He talked the whole time. When we flew back and invited me to some meeting that turned out he wasn't supposed to invite me to. It was a meeting of his economic team, and it was altogether one of the extraordinary experiences I've had in journalism. Just a remarkable guy. And I wrote a piece. I wound up writing a piece about supply-side economics. I obviously learned a little about it before I write, though that's not mandatory in journalism. And wrote a long piece, a few thousand words, leaning heavily on what Jack had told me, and I interviewed some of his allies like Jude Winniski. Jack wanted to convert everybody. Everybody was a potential ally, including a reporter for the Baltimore Sun. I'll have to say, I mean, the way he treated people was to make them feel more influential and important and powerful than they really were, particularly in my case. But I became a fan and hero worshiper of Jack Kemp that day in 1981. Kemp it wasn't just that he was a guy with an idea about taxes and a guy with a bill, the Kemp-Roth bill, and that's fundamental that he was such a great idea person. But the truth is, he was also tremendously important because he could put those things through. He was successful. I mean, when you think of the important events that came along in the 70s in particular, one was the discovery of Jack Kemp by the Wall Street Journal editorial page. Obviously, a hugely important event. The Wall Street Journal became a paper with it. I mean, it has an extraordinarily influential editorial page and became a champion of supply-side economics. So you have that meeting. And then you have the meeting that Alan referred to when Kemp and Jude Winniski and Dave Smick and some others went out to California to convert Reagan. And Reagan was obviously turned out to be a willing convert. But absent that meeting, remember in the Reagan campaign, he was stressing the welfare queen and cutting spending and not tax cuts. But he did wound up adopting supply-side economics, getting it passed through Congress. And not only that, supply-side has now become something that will never go away. It's the orthodoxy of the Republican Party. It's been followed in countries all around the world if they truly wanted to invigorate their economies. And it's all a result of one man, Jack Kemp.
Good first round. Now, I just wanted to ask people down this line whether any of you have any standout personal memories of Jack, or what is your standout personal memory? Some people have already cited one. You don't all have to throw one in, but if there's something that really stands out in your mind, is there?
Well, I'll give you one. It's kind of a famous story that's been around now for a while about Jack, but there's a point that isn't often made about it that I want to make, and that is Jack was in Puerto Rico at one point, and he had gained some prominence by this time with all that he had been doing on the supply-side economics thing, and he was walking in Puerto Rico, and a woman walked up to him and said, "Aren't you Jack Kemp?" And Jack, of course, smiled and said, yes, I am. And she said, "Well, aren't you a congressman?" And Jack said, "Well, yes, I am." And she said, "Well, then you know Bob Walker." And this had come from the C-SPAN work that we had been doing on the floor that Jack was not totally enamored of. Jack didn't think that was the way in which we ought to proceed on doing things. But when he told me this story, he said to me, "Walker," he said, "I played second fiddle behind O.J. Simpson at Buffalo. I'll be darned if I'm going to play second fiddle to Bob Walker in the Congress." So he said, "I think what I'm going to have to do one of these days is run for president." And I said, "Okay, Jack, but it sounds like I need to run against you." And so he laughed. But the fact was that he had a sense of humor about this stuff too. It was typical of Kemp and typical of the style of leadership that he brought to all of us. And I certainly agree with all my colleagues here today who said that when he walked into the room, he was somebody who really brought with him a sense of leadership that was not emulated by anybody else in the party at that point.
Anybody else have a standout personal memory that they want to share?
I do.
Okay.
I do.
Okay.
Triggered by Bob's comments. And this has to do with, I think, the only time that I saw Jack kind of taken back. And Joanne, I think, is going to remember this, but we were having dinner, Priscilla and I, with Jack and Joanne, and I think that Trent and Tricia were there. I can't remember Vin or... Where? This is at the Kemp's home.
Could have been.
We were having dinner. And as Jack would, as soon as we sat down at the table, it was democratic capitalism, small d, Democrat lower tax rates, growth, incentives. And my wife Priscilla, who some of you know her, she's a fairly small gal. She looked at Jack, slapped the table, and said, "Nobody gives a damn, Jack." And he just he reared back in his chair and stunned for maybe half a second, and then proceeded right on.
Bob made me think of something, because we were always trying to get Jack to do more special orders, because that was, you have to give Gingrich credit for that. Newt understood the power of C-SPAN, and he said to me, "You got to go. Jack will listen to you. Go talk to him and tell him he needs to do more special orders. Tell him that he might have 500,000 people watching him. That's a great audience." So I went to talk to Jack, and I said, You really need to participate more in special orders. We're educating the country. This is what you're best at. You got 500,000 people out there. He says, "Yes, but I can't hear them cheering." I thought, okay, there's no one there to cheer. That said a lot about, seriously, the kind of energy that he would get out of a crowd just wasn't there. That was not what he was going to do.
Right.
I have a...
Okay.
An episode here. Stan Evans used to put on these seminars, and all these people would speak, and we'd have, Jack would be about maybe next to last or something like that, and he would just, as people know, a little bit verbose from time to time, and he was 20 minutes, and it was, half hour, 45 minutes past, he's still not getting, he's still not moving. And Hatch is supposed to be, Senator Hatch is the one who was supposed to speak next. And so, somebody runs up to Jack and says, "Senator Hatch is here, it's overtime and all that." And he takes it, and he actually ripped it up. He ripped it up, and he talked it again for another half hour. So after that, we scheduled Jack last. He was the last person to speak so that nobody else, would come in. Of course, that reminded me of a story of Jim Roberts. He might have been fired or something as a result of this, but there was a story that he told about Jack about being, this apocryphal story about being captured by the Nazis in World War II. And then the Gestapo agent comes up to him and talks to Jack and says, "Mr. Kemp, we have ways of making you stop talking." Anyway, those are my...
Okay, all right. Now, let's go back to before Reagan. In '74, Jack began promoting basically business tax cuts to stimulate job creation, and then in '76, he develops Kemp Roth, 30% individual tax rate cuts. That was first introduced in 1977. So I gather that his interest in taxes, because he wasn't on the House Ways and Means Committee, comes from the hardship in his district. I mean, is that a correct assumption?
Yeah. I mean, that's what he always told me, is that he, the economy took a dip, and he was not. Joanne could answer this question better than we could. But as he explained it to me, he didn't come to Congress really with a well-formed economic philosophy. He came to Congress representing a district that was going through very great difficulties, and he realized he didn't have anything to go back and tell them. And so he started studying economics and trying to come up with something positive to say to a blue-collar town that was in decline, as most manufacturing towns were at that time. And that set him on the course of learning what we then started to talk about as supply-side economics. But it was a necessity for him to go back and actually have something positive to say, a plan for the people in his district who were hurting.
It wasn't just sloganeering, but he used great slogans, like "a rising tide lift all boats." He must have used that in just about every speech. And he did work with Jude Winniski, as Fred pointed out. They were conspirators with supply side economics, and they preached it. And I can remember him coming up to me and saying, "You got to read the editorial page of the Wall Street Journal every day, because that's going to get you on your way." And I did, and kept me going for a while.
Like Bob, I mean, it was an attractive idea from the outset, because I ran for the first time in 1976 in an 11-way primary. And one of the things that set me apart in an 11-way primary was the fact that I adopted supply-side economics. Now, it was literally in its infancy at that point. Jack had just begun talking about it and so on. But it struck me as being attractive.
Where did you pick it up?
Well, I was an aide on Capitol Hill at that point. I was working for my predecessor, and picked it up largely because Jack was promoting it among the other members of Congress beginning in the 74-75 time frame, and then was moving it toward what eventually became Kemp Roth in 77. And so I picked it up along that way, and it immediately struck me as the kind of visionary approach to politics that Republicans hadn't taken before, and it proved to be a pretty positive element in my primary campaign in the spring of 1976.
So, let me tell a story I just heard actually recently. What made it so important for Kemp to go out and talk to Ronald Reagan in 1979 about supply-side economics and actually convert him was because Reagan by then took Jack Kemp very seriously. As a person who he admired and listened to and paid attention to in Congress. Earlier in 1979, as it turned out, and I heard about this from Dave Smick, who was the chief of staff for a while when Kemp was in Congress, Kemp had put together a paper on the exciting subject of urban policy. And it was 7 or 8 pages, and he'd sent it out under the frank to a huge mailing list. And to his surprise, he got a response to it from Ronald Reagan. And Reagan had taken this long thing on urban policy and written all in the notes, but not just things like, good point, or not where you're just sort of being nice and saying good point and, glad to hear you're interested in urban policy. Reagan had written incredible, all up and down the sidelines about what Kemp had written about. On the back of the pages, he'd written more about his own experiences in urban policy as governor of California, and on and on. And it was a remarkable thing. And of course, Kemp was very pleased to see that Ronald Reagan, he didn't even know Reagan was on the mailing list, much less would respond in such a serious way to a subject like urban policy, and said, if you want to talk about this, I've had these experiences and so on. Remarkable. But it was important that by then, Ronald Reagan took Jack Kemp very seriously. This is something like early 79.
Kemp is not in Ways and Means. He starts getting into tax policy. And it wasn't only the Democrats who were criticizing him, but Republicans as well. I mean, Ways and Means Republicans, Chowder and Marching Society Republicans. What do you remember of the kind of flack he was taking from his own conference?
Voodoo economics. Well,
that was the 80 campaign. That's Gerald Ford. Gerald Ford actually didn't like it either, but George Bush. Yeah, but what do you remember about the kind of reaction that he got from his own House colleagues? Connie?
Yeah, the thought comes to my mind of the Chowder and Marching group, and of which Jack was a member.
And were you?
Yes. And I remember one situation where he came in and the same enthusiasm. Now, most of these guys in Chowder and Marching were what I would classify as people who had great enthusiasm about anything. But so Jack was, just coming in was kind of stirred things up. But in this, as you go around the room, each person makes their own report about whatever they want to talk about. This particular day, Jack said, if we follow these policies that I've been talking about, the market's going to go to 3,000. Now this is 1983, and I don't remember what the market was. It might have been around 1,200. I'm not sure. But at some point he said, and you're going to see this market go to 10,000. Well, of course, after Jack got through, out he went. Well, you should have heard the rumbling around that room. This guy is crazy. What the hell does he know? He's a quarterback. And this is in 1983. So this is after Kemp Roth has passed, and the old bulls are still, what the hell does he know? But Jack did know, and he always made sure that you knew.
So the old bulls just thought he was crazy, or did they resent that he was playing on their turf?
Well, there was resentment. There was a lot of grumbling about, because Jack had the ability to appeal to the press in a Reagan-esque fashion. He could go appeal to the American people, and a lot of guys, without naming any of them, resented that. I mean, they didn't have that capacity, and also they frankly took the old view that you count the beans and you don't worry about growth. And Jack was about growth, and frankly, that continues to be a problem today, to convince people that you can grow if you cut taxes. Doesn't make sense. It's not intuitive. But he was right then. It worked, and it should work again.
Cut tax rates.
Tax rates.
Let me ask a question here about that, because the point is, in '78, as I understood it, the Republicans almost unanimously were backing Kemp Roth. So in other words, in the House. And the point is, I think there were only like 3 different people who, at least as I recall.
I don't think it was Kemp Roth so much. I think it was just personalities, guys.
No. But what happened in '78? Why did all of these Republicans suddenly now support it? In other words, you're talking about the old bulls that get opposed to it, and in '78.
Preliminary victory. I wasn't there, but the Steiger Amendment, which cut the capital gains tax, was actually the first supply side victory.
Yeah. Okay.
So,
but don't forget.
But what about California? How about the Jarvis thing? Did that have an impact? I'm just asking. I don't know.
When was that? 82?
No, that was 78 too. So look,
just make one more point.
Alan is right. In the '78 election, the Republican National Committee adopted Kemp Roth as policy, and absolutely every member on the House Republican side was behind it. And I was going to ask you, how did that happen? Those of you
I can give you a political answer. In 1978, I wasn't in Congress. I was managing a campaign for Rudy Boschwitz for the United States Senate, and Dick Wirthlin was our pollster, who was President Reagan's pollster later on. And I do remember sitting down with Wirthlin to talk about the issues. And the biggest issue in the country was inflation. But Dick said to us at that time, he said, the problem is nobody in the country thinks you can do anything about inflation. They're not right, but he said, people don't think you can do anything about inflation. But the impact of inflation on this steeply progressive tax code had the effect of pushing everybody into a higher tax bracket. Yeah. And so his advice was, people do think you can do something about taxes. They may not understand anything about inflation. They don't believe politicians who say they're going to cure inflation. But they do think you can do something about taxes, and taxes is what you should run on, even though the polls said that inflation was the biggest issue.
I remember 1978 was when we were just beginning to recover. I mean, when Bob and I were running in '76, it was a very, very bad year for Republicans, following the Watergate mess. And it was just a horrible time. By '78, we were beginning to see the possibilities for recovery, and this was a great new idea that was out there that Republicans could get around. But not everybody in '78 had bought into the larger theory behind this, because there was still the feeling that the most important thing was to do something about deficits. And so
I have a question, and some of you all may be able to answer this. You'll remember back that Bob Novak was promoting Jack as a presidential candidate in 1980, yeah. Which turned out obviously to be Ronald Reagan's year, and Jack didn't run. But how seriously did he take that?
Well, I remember him talking with a number of us, and I remember when he endorsed Ronald Reagan with the words, Ronald Reagan, the oldest man running for president with the youngest ideas. Yeah. Now, Jack loved him because they were his ideas. But I mean, I remember when he said that, and I remember he was committed to Ronald Reagan at that time for that. You got to remember, I ran in '76 and lost, and I remember one of the reasons we lost because I listened to the debate where Gerald Ford unfortunately freed all of Eastern Europe, if you recall, 3 times asked whether he made a mistake, and if you'll recall, that was not the high point of his campaign. In '78, we had malaise, remember that? We had a President of the United States putting a sweater on and saying that we're all going to have to hunker down together and just kind of go through it. There was a lack of enthusiasm, there was a lack of vision, there was a lack of excitement. Jack Kemp, for us as Republicans running in 78, gave us that in the non-presidential election year. There was Kemp Roth. There was something we could rally around. There was something positive. And I know we talk about the old bulls, but let me just put a good word in from Bob Michael. Bob Michael was sort of like the friendly uncle of Jack Kemp. He was part of Old Bull, but part intrigued by this guy, Jack Kemp. And I think, frankly, Bob Michael gave Jack some leash that he wouldn't otherwise have. Barbara Conable was a different type of guy, but a very respectful guy. And when we had that debate on the floor of the House to pass the tax bill, Barbara actually divided the time up. And I mean, I even had time that I was in charge of for the young guys to speak on it. I mean, he was open to what Jack was saying. Jack converted him. So it was partly the substance, but it was also the personality. And I've always thought that it does go back to Jack working as a football player and a quarterback who had to inspire his teammates. And there was a sense of inspiring us, and frankly, there wasn't anybody else around on the congressional side. We had Ronald Reagan in the White House inspiring us, Jack inspiring us there, and it was this combination of things. And I always remember one thing. Jack would talk about his family constantly. And he told me something that I used a little bit. He said that oftentimes when he was leaving the house or to go on a trip or something, he would tell his kids, he would say, "Be a leader, you're a Kemp." I used to try that with my kids a little bit too. No, I'm not tell them they were Kemp, but to tell them at a young age that there is something expected of you and that your father has confidence that you can meet that standard. Jack used that with his family, and I think he used that with us as well. And so it was a combination of his life experience, and the supply side economics fit into that experience. It was inspiring. It was, you can work hard, you can succeed, everybody succeeds with you. I mean, that's the message of a team. And Jack was able to sell it because he believed it. I think there was a little resentment, I would say, with some, because Jack spoke too long at times. I remember at least one time I told him, he said, "How'd I do?" After a speech, I said, "You gave 3 great speeches." He said, "What do you mean?" I said, "You had 3 opportunities to stop and you chose the 4th one." And he would get that hurt look on his face and then he would laugh about it. But I think that was part of it. When you have some people who've been in the permanent minority for so long, don't know what it's like to be in the majority, don't believe in the power of ideas. And here you got this guy coming in with the power of ideas who talks about it, is not afraid of talking about it, and is convinced that you can convince even your most ardent adversary. That's kind of jarring.
To go back to your question, though, more the more serious effort that occurred in 1980 was there was a serious effort to put Jack on the ticket as a vice presidential candidate. I mean, we
were also, I'm being serious. Human Events was a big supporter of that. When we were advocating basically that Kemp become the vice president and all the rest of it. But the thing that I don't understand, I mean, maybe somebody can help me out here, is that Jack, I mean, he had a brain trust. He had Irving Kristol and all these people who wanted, and you know, Winooski and all these people, and they wanted him to run. They wanted him to run for the Senate against Javits, and then that fell through. And then they wanted him to be vice president, and then he sort of went along. He did go along with that, but for some reason, he never wanted to run in New York, and I don't know quite why, but was it the idea that he was afraid that he didn't want to be opposed to Javits in some way, that he maybe expected Javits to resign. I just don't know the reason for that, because people were pumping him for higher offices, at least as early as 78. And I just didn't know whether any of you were aware of that or not.
That's assuming the Senate is a higher office than the House of
Representatives. Oh, okay.
Right. I think he had a personal attachment to Javits. I can't swear to it, but I think that he just respected the guy and just didn't want to take him on. That's my recollection.
There are a couple of other points of history that I want to ask you about. One was supposedly in January of 1976, Jude Winooski calls up, gets an appointment with Jack in the morning. They go all day long and talk about this. Jack had been the advocate of the Jobs Creation Act, which was basically a business tax cut thing, and Winooski supposedly converted Jack to being an individual tax cut sponsor, and that Kemp Roth originally ultimately came out of that. Did he ever talk about this Winooski meeting or the conversion?
No, Winooski talked about it.
Tell me, because Winooski's dead, so tell me what you heard from...
That's the way he told it, and look, it was a crucial alliance between the Wall Street Journal editorial page and Jack Kemp, and Jude Winooski took the full credit for that, but he did deserve some. I mean, of course, the key figure there was Bob Bartley, who was the editorial page editor, but the discovery of Jack Kemp by them was hugely important, and Winooski, and if you listen to Winooski, and I did many times, and some of you all probably have too, his role was humongous.
Well,
Jude's role.
Well, let me talk about a little bit about Winooski. He was my classmate at UCLA, and when he was there, we played poker together. And he was a communist. He was a Marxist at the time. It was very interesting to me. And we were always debating or whatever it was. And I was an anti-communist, and he was a communist. And then suddenly to see him at the Wall Street Journal lecturing Jack Kemp on free market economics, I just thought was sort of ironic, and from my point of view. But there was no question. I was on a panel or a radio program with Jude, and Jude was he was always selling supply side economics, but I also believe that he did play a major role. I mean, I don't think, even though he may have exaggerated, but he was always down there with Jack at lunch. And they were always doing something. Every time I called up, and people would say, when Jack came out with a bad idea, they said, well, that was Jude. He just saw him. And then, that was what I think it was for Louis Farrakhan. I think that was it. Well, that was Jude. He said, come out for Louis Farrakhan. So the point is, Jude did play a major role in this. I mean, I don't want to belittle his role, whatever. And I don't think Bartley played as much. I mean, he had on the Wall Street Journal, but it was Laffer, Mundell, Paul Craig Roberts. Those were the people I think that he relied upon for material input. And of course, John Mueller as well.
So did all of you meet with the Winooskis and the Laffers and the Mundells and so on? Did Jack have seminars for the Amigos and for the Conservative Opportunity?
Well, we had a lot of dinners at Kemp's house. Joanne was kept busy feeding all Jack's colleagues. But they were all fascinating. I mean, it wasn't just to come out and shoot the bull with Jack. We'd have Irving Kristol or Michael Novak or Art Laffer or somebody who was constantly interested in educating us, raising up our consciousness level. A lot of that went on. Yeah, and Winooski was a constant presence.
I remember a time that he took a group of us up to New York, along with our spouses and so on. We spent a long weekend in New York, and part of this was, having all of these people talk to us about just what the state of play was on economics. But we also did foreign policy. Gene Kirkpatrick was there. It was a
Steve Forbes.
Steve Forbes.
What period would this have been?
87 maybe.
I'd say earlier.
86, 87, probably somewhere in that.
Time you went to New York, or the...
Yeah, the New York.
Okay, the second point is, which a lot of you have referred to, is the quote-unquote conversion of Ronald Reagan at this meeting. It was early 1980. There's a meeting at I think the Marriott outside LAX, and Jack and Dave Smick and John Mueller and Arthur Laffer and Jude Winooski were all there, along with the California team of Reagans. Now, Lou Lehrman and Dave Smick refer to this going out there as, quote unquote, the boarding party. If you ask Ed Meese about this, he says, oh no, Reagan was a supply-sider before there was supply-side. He just was instinctively a supply-sider, a low-tax person, and that he didn't need any conversion.
Yeah, but he didn't have.
Well, tell me what your.
Yeah, I know, but he didn't have a bill. He didn't have a program. Obviously, he was instinctively a supply-sider and a tax cutter, but Kemp came out with a program for him.
But he raised taxes when he was governor of California.
But he had to balance the budget and all the rest of it. But no, there's
that's
no
why people. Well, that's why people usually raise taxes.
Yeah. No, they had to. No, but I mean, you're forced to in a state. You don't have to. You can't just print money the way we can back here. And so that they have to balance the budget. But I remember Reagan. I saw him out in California, and it seemed to me that he was not a supply sider. He didn't really understand it at the time. And
This
I
is
remember,
when?
Oh, this was, I can't remember. It was when he was running, I don't know, before he was running for president, but I don't remember whether it was, or maybe it was when he was
Well, he
running
wasn't
after
the supply
governor.
side when he ran in 76
That's what I'm
against
saying.
Ford.
He was not. He didn't know anything about it. Kemp was the one who, I mean, everyone here is
What I heard from, I think, Lynn Nofziger and others was that Reagan had been through a personal experience where in Hollywood where his income went up rather rapidly, and so his taxes went up rather rapidly, and he had an instinctive aversion to high marginal tax rates, but no comprehensive theory of how that related to economic growth. That's what Jack taught.
That's exactly right.
Well, when he was governor, what happened in California was we did not have withholding for our income tax, and he was adamant against it until he realized that he would run afoul of the California Constitution, not able to balance the budget, and he had a famous press conference where he had said that his feet were stuck in concrete against withholding. And he had a famous press conference when he went up and he used his fingernail to go across the microphone. It's made a noise, and he said, the sound that you've just heard is the concrete cracking around my feet, and came out for it. But what he did was, as he was leaving office, he put a proposition on the ballot which would have limited spending as a percentage of, I think, the state domestic product, and then it was a limitation on how much it could go up. Well, that lost.
But it lost.
Well, it lost, but then 2 years later, in 1978, we had Prop 13, which cut taxes, limited taxes at property tax levels. So Ronald Reagan,
it wasn't really a supply side.
No.
Property taxes weren't the problem.
I understand, but oh no, they were a huge problem in California.
No, but I understand, and they were not the problem from a supply side point of view.
I know, but you have to understand that's the context in which Ronald Reagan was looking at things as we came out of 78, going into 80. So he was looking more on the side of limiting spending, and then the idea of property tax in California, which I think meant that he was ripe for an intervention by Jack Kemp. I was already supporting him for president in 79. There was nothing contrary that he was saying, but I think when Jack went out there, I think Jack convinced himself that Ronald Reagan was the guy for president when Ronald Reagan bought onto supply side economics, and he came back enthused to support Ronald Reagan and threw everything behind Ronald Reagan at that point in time.
I think Vin is exactly right on this thing about it. There was, I mean, Reagan did not. I mean, I love Ed Meese, but he tended to be protective of Ronald Reagan and says that Reagan knew it all. You know, whenever.
Well, Meese does cite this, which you referred to, policy directive number 1 or policy decision number 1, which is August of 1979.
Right.
And written by Martin Anderson.
That's right. That's what
which contains Kemp Roth as one of its items. So then Kemp goes out in the beginning of the next year of 1980, and the question is, was Reagan already converted, or did he not quite have it in his mind, or did Reagan convince Kemp that he was converted, or what's your impression of whether this was a necessary conversion or a affirmation?
I think it's when it became the centerpiece of the campaign.
Right.
I mean, I think that Reagan had bought into kind of the overall Kemp-Roth type of approach, perhaps, and had included that as a piece of what he was doing. But I think probably that meeting assured that it would become a center point of the Reagan campaign as they moved into the early primaries.
Okay. There was during the lead up to the '81 tax bill, Arthur Laffer wrote a piece in the Wall Street Journal saying that tax cuts more than pay for themselves. More than pay for themselves. Did Jack Kemp believe that? Did all of you believe that? As opposed to the return, the economic return being enough that the face amount of the tax cut could be recouped, some of it. I mean, the question was, did Kemp believe that tax cuts paid for themselves?
Yes.
And did you all? And do you?
Under the context of that time, absolutely.
Well, I think that Jack definitely did. I think that there was a constant education process which he was not reluctant to engage in with all of his colleagues. A lot of his colleagues didn't believe it. I can remember discussions saying, well, it can't really work. But it did work. And I'm not sure if I was totally sold at the time, but I'm sold on it now. I wish we had it to do all over again.
Yeah, tax revenues did go up.
Yeah, right.
But did they go up by the amount of the
No, because we increased spending. Now, I can speak to that because of the appropriations process. We had a Democratic Congress, and we cut tax rates, and revenues went way up, but spending exceeded it. And so the Democrats today always say, well, it didn't work. But it did work. Because the revenues were substantially higher than they were projected to be by the budget people way back then.
More?
He absolutely believed. I can remember before I was in Congress, after the '78 election, I organized a group of young Republicans in Minnesota, and Jack came out and spoke to us. And I do remember him proselytizing on exactly this issue. And everybody there was kind of wanting to believe what he believed, but they were pushing him. And I do remember somebody asked Jack, okay, I said, I believe that tax cuts will generate more revenues than they lose, but isn't there a lag between the time you pass the tax cut and the time the growth actually kicks in? And Jack said adamantly, no, there's no lag. It'll be immediate, instantaneous. I'm not sure I believed all that, but he really believed.
I mean, it seems to me whether it was Jack and American Renaissance or whatever, I mean, I remember Human Events was opposed. I mean, I just had come there, and we were opposed to the Kennedy tax cuts on the ground that it was somehow they were going to increase inflation. I mean, it was the old way of looking at it, and Arthur Burns and all these Republicans were, were opposed to it, and so yeah, we were opposed to it, and. But Jack, when he talked about it, he got something from Walter Heller, and I couldn't imagine Walter Heller. He was Jack's, or he was Kennedy's chief economics guru.
Walter Heller.
And Heller,
I know Walter.
And I remember Heller as giving the wrong advice to Adenauer and to Earhart, and we used to call him wrong way Heller. That's what everyone said. So if Heller was for it, it couldn't be good. That was the way that we looked at it at Human Events. And Jack found out about it. He got something from Heller actually when he said Heller was for it for the wrong reasons, and that was his point. And then he said he actually examined the tax cut, and he claimed at the time that he got some sort of a memo from Heller in which Heller said that it had more than paid for itself, that the Kennedy tax cuts more than paid for themselves. And the point is Kemp and the Wall Street Journal ran on that. I mean, they said, look, they did pay themselves. And then when he talked about the Mellon tax cuts, he would say it all the time. So there's no question in my mind, he did believe that the tax cuts would pay for themselves and more than pay for themselves. And when he writes about it, he talks about the incentives. He's on the people on the lower end. They need to have their brackets knocked down too, because they're being pushed into upper brackets, and therefore the incentive, that was his view, their incentive was to not work or to loaf or to go on a cruise or something like that. And his idea was that even people on the lower end were going to, if they found the incentives better off, and that they would work more and produce more, and they would be more. I know he believed that. I'm absolutely certain he believed
Certainly believed the opposite, too, because I think probably all of us were involved in the secret cabal at one time when the Reagan people decided to raise taxes, and we went to a meeting down at the base of Capitol Hill and so on, where Jack had organized it, and we were all going to be against Reagan on this, but we were going to hold it secret until we had a chance to organize our thoughts on it and so on. And so we all marched out of the room and downstairs with the idea that by tomorrow we were going to have a plan into the biggest bank of television cameras I've ever seen in my life, and so on, because people had caught up with the secret. But I mean, Jack's whole point at that moment was that if Reagan bought into the higher taxes, that in fact it was going to slow down the economy, revenues would drop, and that it would lead to
This was Tefra, this was 82?
Tefra 1, Tefra 2, DEFRA, there were three different, but this was the first one, the first Tefra.
82, wasn't it?
82, yeah, it would have been 82.
Yeah.
So where was this cabal? Where did this?
It was I'm not certain, Bob, was it in the building where you have your offices? It was in one of the buildings that was right down at the base of Capitol Hill. We were up on the top story of it, and I mean, it was a huge group of members that was together that evening.
That you were going to oppose your president.
We were going to oppose. Yeah, the idea was we were organizing to oppose the president on something, which was a pretty big deal at that juncture. And Jack was organizing us on this. But it was all going to be a secret until we walked down and saw the bank of television cameras.
Reagan was very unhappy with this. If you read, I've recently read Reagan's diaries. He kept a diary during his whole presidential term. And believe me, Jack Kemp's name comes up a lot, usually going to Reagan and complaining about something and urging, and starting in 1982 is when it began. And there are a number of other times later. I mean, Kemp was certainly not afraid to take his objections right into the Oval Office.
Remember that the tax bill, as great a victory as it was, wasn't exactly what Jack wanted. No. We wanted 30%, not 25, and more important than that, we didn't want it phased in over 3 years. Yeah. I never heard Jack complain about going from 30 to 25, but I do remember him saying repeatedly, phasing it in over 3 years is a big mistake, but this is the best we're going to do.
Backloading it was going to prevent the immediate effect from taking place.
Yeah. Yep. So what was Jack's role, and what role did you all play in actually passing the 81 tax bill? I mean, Jack was by that time a member of the leadership, obviously, number 3, but what role did you all play in getting it passed? I mean, it wasn't, because he's not on Ways and Means. Any memories of that?
Wasn't there.
Right. Okay.
Well, I mean, most of us at that point were kind of the junior, and we were kind of the stormtroopers, I guess, on it, who made certain that we held the Republicans together on it. There were people who were looking to backslide on this and were looking to modify it even more than it ended up being modified. And it was basically a lot of the younger members who took that on and said, no, we need to have an aggressive bill.
Okay. Who recruited the Democrats like Kent Hance and others? I mean, obviously there were a lot of conservative Democrats in the House then that aren't there now.
Is it Phil Graham?
Phil Graham was there.
Phil Graham. And he was the co-sponsor of the spending cuts. He was the spending cuts.
Phil was more on the spending cuts. Dick Shelby. Those guys voted with us on those sorts of things. The other thing that I would think about is that at that time, the locus of ideas came out of the Republicans in the House, along with Ronald Reagan. You weren't getting the ideas out of the Senate. And it didn't matter whether it was on defense policy or whether it was on tax cuts, different way looking at certain social issues and so forth. That really came out of the House. So Jack was the leader on supply side economics and some of these other things we've mentioned, but he gave us an enthusiasm that allowed us to go forward. And yes, I don't know how you would call us, we weren't part of the leadership, but the leadership, frankly, had to go along. And more and more enthusiastically as we saw the successes that we had at the polls. Remember, Republicans hadn't had an opportunity to really take over the agenda for a generation, and we were able to do that even though we're in the minority in the House because of the power of ideas. I mean, it was an exciting time because Jack was convinced the power of ideas could change things. He convinced us, or we were already convinced of that, and that really moved our party along. And then you have
enough of the Democrats were looking at the energy that we had and the results of the 1980 election, and not at all sure that this wasn't a wave that was going to continue to build. And I think that created an environment in which I don't know that we converted a whole lot.
Fear is a great motivator.
Yes, fear is a great motivator.
Okay, one other historical item. At the 80 convention, there's buzz that Jack might have been vice president. Was any of you part of the demonstrations, part of the claque for that to happen? Okay, it obviously didn't happen. Tell me about those of you who were members of the Amigos. That's Connie Mack and Vin. What staff was never there. So what was the Amigos, the 5 Amigos? Newt Gingrich, Trent Lott, Jack Kemp, and the 2 of you.
No.
No.
How did the Amigos get going, and what?
Well, we got named because Jack wanted to meet at a Mexican restaurant.
That's exactly right.
I'd like to give more ideological content to that name, but that was the reason.
That's exactly right.
Which Mexican restaurant was it?
Oh, it was the one on the Senate side, kind of.
Yeah,
What
it's,
was?
let's see, I can't remember the name.
I can't remember either.
Okay, so what did you guys do?
Well, the one meeting I recall of the Amigos was during the Bush years. Now, so he's Secretary of HUD.
That's right.
And Bob Teeter was at this meeting as well. And this is after the Gulf War, and it's before Bush is going to give his speech to the country, coming off that great victory. And this little group was trying to convince Teeter that he needed to encourage Bush to come out with some bold ideas domestically that the country needed to hear from the president on domestic issues, and so that was and I've forgotten now what the details we were talking to about, but Teeter's response was, "We're going to ride this victory in the Gulf War to victory in November."
Much of our focus also was on cutting capital gains tax. The economy was slowing down. Capital gains tax rates had been equalized with income tax rates as probably the only mistake that was part of the 1986 Tax Reform Act. And Jack and we were all trying to convince the administration that they needed to have a growth package, and the key of it was reducing the capital gains tax, which Jude Winniski referred to as the bone in the throat of the American economy. And I remember meeting with Nick Brady, who said, after we made this whole pitch to him and talked to him about it and tried to explain it, he said, Ronald Reagan was the son of an alcoholic from Dixon, Illinois. He could run on something like that. But George Bush is the son of a United States Senator. He can never champion a cut in the capital gains tax.
So do the Amigos start early and go, and then you guys continued meeting for years and years later, all the way into Bush? Do you remember when it started?
It could have started that.
It might have started over the capital gains issue.
Yeah, and so it started late.
Really?
And I think probably the last meeting of the Cinco Amigos was with Jack after he was chosen to be vice president, and we had dinner with him. Well, I could swear you were there.
I thought you were too, but
we had dinner with Jack up in his suite at the convention. And of course, it was kind of one of those high five, congratulations, great, this is exciting. And
but it was as much a support. I think Jack just missed regular contact with his congressional friends, and he wanted to get some of us together. And we talked. Yes, we had some purposes, but as much as anything was Jack wanted to keep in contact with people on Capitol Hill. I remember one of the meetings where we talked about. I'm sure that you've discussed this with other people more, but the visit of Ariel Sharon when he came to town, and he was housing minister in Israel, and he wanted to meet with Jack, and Jim Baker was just dead set against having anybody meet with Ariel Sharon, who was, although he was housing minister, he was the most hawkish guy in the Israeli government at that time. And Jack, I remember Jack said, well, he was going to be the only housing secretary with a foreign policy. So he met. We talked about that. He met with Sharon, and Baker was furious about it, of course.
Yeah. Tell me what the history is of the Conservative Opportunity Society and how it got started and what it did.
Well, I'll give you my take on it because I think I was invited to join this group before it was named that because I had just become a member of the Congress. The big issue when I came in was Jim Wright's attempt to eliminate the third year of the tax cut. I had put together a letter where 147 or whatever the magic number is of my colleagues said, we will support and protect the third year of the Reagan tax cut. And so after doing that, Newt walked up to me one day, a couple of days after, and said, would you like to join a group of guys who want to change the way this place operates and become the majority party? And I said, well, that sounds like a great idea. And so I went to one of these meetings, and it seems like Dan Lundgren, Dan Coates, Henry Hyde.
Not Henry Hyde.
No, not Henry.
No, Henry.
We met in my office, and it was not Henry.
Ed Bethune was.
But in any event,
Ed Bethune.
Ed Bethune,
Duncan Hunter.
Judd
Gregg and Dan Coates were original members, but they grew disenchanted with Newt.
Yeah,
and left.
But what was so fascinating about this group, and it kind of goes back to the ideas thing, is that they were talking about the books that they were reading about policy, and I was kind of stunned, to tell you the truth. And there used to be kind of trading back and forth. Here's something you should read, and so it was a very much at the beginning, anyway, thinking through, trying to develop new ways, new solutions to problems.
So where was Jack? Was Jack in the Conservative Opportunity Society or not?
The COS was Gingrich. And the first people that he recruited were Bob and I to join him.
He recruited. He basically went around and figured out who some of the activist members were, and kind of began the process of recruiting people who had shown a propensity toward activism.
This begins when?
He came up to me.
83.
I remember when he came up. Well, he came up to me, and we had a lame duck session after the 1982 election.
Right.
And I remember on the last day of the session, I didn't really know Newt that well. But I'd listened to him in conferences, and I kind of agreed with his political approach. You know much better than I did. And he came up to me on the floor, and he said, "What are you doing for the next 10 years?" That's a typical Gingrich comment. I said, "Gee, I don't know, hanging out with you, I guess." So and then Bob was the other member that we started. And then the group came together. But I have to say, Jack was not a member of COS.
No.
And neither was Trent.
And neither was Trent. And it was a decision on their part not to do that. They were our leaders. They were our inspirations, and particularly in Jack's case. They were our lifeline to the leadership, but they were also very careful. They were not going to get branded as a group of junior member mavericks.
But they did send their staff to all the meetings. Oh, yeah. They had senior staff from their operations that came to all of the COS meetings.
Remember that all-day meeting we had?
Oh, God.
We put butcher paper up on the walls, and we went through vocabulary.
Yeah, right.
We had, Newt would always tell us that we had to learn from the anti-war folks of the 60s how they had captured that moment because they'd captured the vocabulary. And so we actually went down and figured out, we didn't have computers and digital monitors then, we had butcher paper, and we were discussing there what words would we use, what words wouldn't we use. We talked about the Democratic agenda, and we talked about ours being the American agenda, and we chose 3 words: Conservative Opportunity Society, in contradistinction to theirs, Liberal Welfare State. And we actually sat down and figured out why those ideas had a meaning and why they had a difference. And then we used those as the basic overarching theme as we looked at the different issues. Remember, we divided up subject matter. I had criminal justice and immigration. You had...
my role was to kind of manage you guys, make sure that each of you, whatever assignment you had, that you were moving forward with it.
And we started what they now call the theme team. We would figure out what the theme was for the month, for the week. We'd go down and organize 1 minute. No one else was doing it in those days.
Special orders.
And I always remember after we'd finish a meeting, before I get back to my office, there would be a memo from Newt for the 16 things I was supposed to do. It was always that. But I mean, and Jack and Trent were our extensions, our conduits to the leadership, because frankly, we wanted to get something done.
But I have to say, I don't think Jack was ever entirely comfortable with COS, and some of it he was very excited about because we were enthusiastic about all of his issues, but I don't think he was very enthusiastic about us going after Jim Wright or anything like that. I mean, Jack was.
I was going to ask you about that.
Jack was never
what's his attitude toward that confrontation?
Yeah, that was not any part of Jack Kemp's agenda.
Part of it.
Well, and he thought a lot of what we did on the floor, period, was confrontational rather than his agenda, and so therefore I wouldn't say that I agree with Vin. I don't think he was ever entirely comfortable with the approach that we were taking. On the other hand, he was very supportive in terms of assuring that the leadership didn't get in our way to be out doing some of those kinds of things because he saw the value in it.
Right. He wasn't entirely comfortable, but he didn't want to not be involved with us.
Right.
So
I think
what
that's
was
right.
his relationship like with Tip O'Neill and Jim Wright and the Democratic leadership? And I mean, obviously, Newt and you guys were confronting them, trying to embarrass them, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Did he cheer you on? I mean, did he quietly cheer you on? Did he get along with them? You know, how?
Yeah, my instincts, and it's instinct more than anything else, is that he maintained a good relationship with Tip and Jim Wright.
I think that's right. I was on appropriations, and he was on appropriations, and we were working our appropriations issues. Jack was always a step above and working the higher issues over the traditional appropriations process, and he got some grumbling from the appropriators that sometimes he didn't come to hearings when he should have come to hearings. But he took an active role in the Foreign Ops Appropriations Subcommittee, and that's where he really became a leader in those international issues. Beyond that, he really was, as time went on, into his own agenda and not necessarily with the warfare.
And don't forget
the Civil War on the floor.
Yeah, don't forget that.
And I wasn't part of the COS either.
I suspect at this point Jack knew too that there were another series of issues coming along with respect to taxes, and if they were going to happen, he had to have these relationships with people on the other side of the aisle. So I think he kept those relationships strong.
He was always positive, and we talked about his motivation. It was, again, growth, empowerment, and individual liberty, and that transcended, that seeped into just about every issue that he preached.
When we put together COS, Newt had the conceptual framework, you guys will remember this, of you needed a set of magnet issues, positive things that would attract you, and you needed a set of wedge issues that would divide the Democratic Party or divide you from the Democrats. There's no such thing as a wedge issue in Jack Kemp's vocabulary, at least as I knew him. Everything was a magnet issue. And if he couldn't convince you, he'd just keep trying. But the notion that we were going to have divisive issues that might, even if they were dividing the country in our favor, that wasn't really part of Jack Kemp's mentality.
Right. Morton, may I ask you a question here? Go back to a point about the '86 tax reform, because I just wanted to ask you about that, because we did, I know that Jude Winniski, he got mad at us and all of this, and I just wanted to mention tax reform, and I called it a mystery pudding, and because we were not very big on it, we were skeptical of it, and the point is, one of the major reasons was the rise in the capital gains tax. Because I mean, these supply siders, everyone has told me this is the key to prosperity. It's capital gain, capital gain. And then I said, you're going to raise it 40%? I said, I don't know whether you guys are right or wrong, but I said it just seemed wrong to me. I would like you to explain to me what happened there, and why you had to do that, and why you thought it was worth it, even despite the bone in the throat, as Winniski's talked about it.
Well, there really were many steps to this thing, and so all of us were in the House when this occurred, and I suspect we all remember. We were, I believe, to the person opposed to the tax reform bill that came out of the House, and we were very upset with Jack for the role that he played in getting it.
Right,
right. And I remember you guys chose me to challenge Jack at the conference.
Do you recall, do you recall Ronald Reagan coming to a conference and convincing us that we should vote for it?
After it came out of
remember that?
The Senate.
Is that, well, that's one that just...
No, because
Jack,
I remember...
the history on this is that the rule got defeated, thanks to you guys, and then Jack gets the president to come talk to the conference and to write a letter saying that he will veto anything that comes out of the Senate that doesn't contain a $2,500 personal exemption, and he convinces enough of you, but I don't know about all of you, to vote for the rule and get the bill passed to go to the Senate.
My recollection is that the capital gains problem that Alan's referring to did not emerge until it went through the Senate, but that was Bill Bradley's insistence. The issue when it came out of the House that what was really a business issue. The business community was all up in arms about eliminating all the exemptions and credits and deductions and things like that. And I sat down, I remember talking to Jack and saying, geez, I'm listening to my business people are arguing against this, and he was trying to explain that the lower marginal rates were worth it. I remember finally in exasperation he said to me, Ben, you know what I'd like to do? I'd like to lower the rates and keep all the deductions. He said, but we can't do that.
Did he really say that?
Yeah, he was half joking, but but what he meant was he was not wildly enthused about closing loopholes. He was wildly enthused about reducing the rate.
Yeah, reducing, and again, the emphasis is on marginal.
Marginal
rates. Marginal rates, that's what creates growth.
But I remember that
Lower
conference with Ronald Reagan, because I remember I got up and I asked the president about capital gains. So it had to be an issue at the time the president came before us.
But that was after it passed the Senate.
Well, I can't recall exactly what his answer was, but it wasn't totally satisfactory, but we voted for the entire package.
I want to flip back to the early 80s. Jack was responsible for making David Stockman OMB director. Then David Stockman starts trying to delay the tax cut schedule, and then he comes out with the Atlantic Monthly interview declaring that this is all a Trojan horse and a trickle down economics. What was Jack's response to that? I mean, how did he feel about his best friend, or at least David Stockman called Jack his best friend, doing all that? And how did you guys feel?
I was appalled. I thought it was traitorous, but I don't remember talking with Jack about it.
Yeah,
anybody else?
I don't remember a conversation with Jack.
I know that he criticized Stockman. I know absolutely that he criticized Stockman. I mean, I've seen quotes of him about that, and he was criticizing because of exactly what he was doing there. So I know absolutely that he did take issue with him. He was sharp issue with him.
Okay, we're gonna break for lunch right quick, but I just want to do one more thing. I think who's not coming this afternoon?
I can't.
You can't. Okay. So when Jack opposed TEFRA and the '83 Social Security tax increase, and he wants Paul Volcker to be not reappointed as Fed chairman, and so on. And there was these issues. He's leadership, and yet he is bucking the administration. There was all kinds of guff coming out of the White House, leaked assaults on Jack for putting his personal ambition ahead of the president and stuff like that. How did he take all that? Do you remember? Do you remember the guff that he was taking? It was in Evans and Novak had a column saying that he was not permitted for months to be in Reagan's presence. How did you guys were part of the team opposing these things?
Yeah, the only thing I remember in that time wasn't how he reacted to what the White House may have been saying about him, but he was adamantly opposed to the theme of the 1984 election. If I remember correctly, it was "Stay the Course," and he was.
That was 82 election.
Oh, was that 82?
Off-year election.
Yeah, 84 was Morning America.
Yeah, Morning America was 84.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah, no, 82 was Stay the Course.
I wasn't here though in '84, so that's...
So all of you have repressed or suppressed all that stuff that was coming from the.
I apparently tried to make something up and didn't get away with it.
Okay. We will continue a lot of this this afternoon. Okay. Just let me do one sum up here. The world has heard of Eisenhower Republicans, and there used to be Rockefeller Republicans, and Taft Republicans, and Goldwater Republicans, and there's certainly Reagan Republicans. Are there Kemp Republicans, and what lessons does Jack Kemp's career have to teach the Republican Party for today? I'll just let you run down the line, Bob Walker.
Okay, well, sure, there are Kemp Republicans, and I think when we discussed early on the expansive nature of Jack's involvement in politics, it is about that. I mean, it was Jack that demonstrated leadership not only in terms of growth economics, but how that growth then was going to impact wide numbers of people. his foreign policy was an outreach foreign policy about the condition of human rights and human liberties around the world, and it's a lot of that underlying theme that still is important in the Republican Party, and I think is being expressed in the presidential campaign this year.
You do? You do?
Yeah. Yeah, I did. No, I believe that there certainly is growth economics at the base of most of the discussion of in the Republican Party this year. I believe that there's also a belief in a U.S. presence in the world that is a positive presence, and I think that's a legacy that Jack Kemp has.
I think I'll just be brief. I sort of go back to what I said in my opening remark. I think that the Kemp Republicans exist, and they are people that believe we got to have something to say to everybody. That we can't be a 51% majority nation, that the Republican Party has to be able to have a message for African Americans and Hispanics and union members and inner city folks. And maybe we don't get it all right, maybe not every policy is perfect, but that if we are not constantly striving to have a message to communicate to everybody, we're failing.
That's interesting. That's the same kind of theme that I would say. I mean, I clearly, yes, there are Kemp Republicans. I would consider myself to be a Kemp Republican, a Reagan Republican, because I do see them as in pretty much the same light. But I think the party desperately needs someone like Jack Kemp today. And the word that I would have used would be, inclusive. There's got to be a way for Republicans to be more inclusive. We just seem to keep narrowing down our fundamental base. Jack, and the other thing about it, Jack had the courage to stand up and challenge things that he disagreed with, both privately and publicly. And we all know it's not an easy thing to stand up and tell people that you think they're wrong.
Including the president.
Including the president. But Jack had the courage to do that. And I think today we're missing a person who, again, really wants to bring people into our party and to be inclusive, find ways to give people opportunity and hope.
As somebody who still describes himself as a Kemp Republican, I fully agree with what especially Connie and Vin have just said. Jack led the effort of Mickey Edwards and me and Ed Bethune and others who had substantial minority populations, particularly in the African American area, in our districts, and who had gone in and appealed to those votes. But he got us all together and took us over to the RNC and demanded that they formulate a core group to go after African Americans, and they did. Bob Wright came in as the director, and with great effect, we started doing better, but we've never done sufficiently well. But Jack was all-inclusive. He didn't exclude anybody. And if he heard a disparaging remark, a racial remark, a criticism of that sort, he'd come down hard on the offender. But also, Ronald Reagan's 11th commandment was, don't speak ill of your fellow Republican. For crying out loud, we've forgotten that in this primary process. And I think both Jack and Ronald Reagan would be offended with some of the rhetoric that's come from all sides among our erstwhile leaders who would run for president this time.
Yep. The thing is I think Jack had a perfect message for the time and for the place, and I still think it's an important part. But I really think that what the Republicans have to do, they need someone, I don't know, maybe whoever, to have to deal with these entitlement reforms. And that's one thing Jack was not really very good at, and I felt that he was poor at that, actually. And the thing is, they wanted to campaign against Dole because he was trying to, stop or expand the COLAs. I mean, he was trying to, freeze the COLAs. And Jack was going to go after him for that when he ran in 1988, and I was very opposed to that and wrote something about that. But the thing is that unless we get control of that, unless we get somebody who can deal with those issues, the country is going to be lost anyway. That's my view.
I agree with that, but I got to make one point.
What?
the person in the Republican Party who is most aggressively pursuing that today is Paul Ryan, who would be the most adamant in describing himself as a Kemp Republican.
Oh, no, I agree with that, but I'm just saying that Jack didn't do it. That was all. That was my only point. I just saying we need today. No, I agree with that. I agree with that.
And look, Paul Ryan is the most important policy thinker among not just Republicans on Capitol Hill right now. And I've talked to him a great deal about this, and he talks so enthusiastically about the time when he was just out of college and worked for Jack at Empower America, and he says all these big name economists were coming through, and he could sit into the meetings when Jack would be talking about him, and said he learned an enormous amount. And he's also one who seeks friends and allies everywhere among Democrats. Doesn't find many. I think Jack found more.
He got Wyden.
He got Wyden?
Yeah, he got Wyden.
Well, actually, Wyden got him.
Okay, all right.
Alice Rivlin, too. Go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, I just wrote a piece for the Ripon Forum saying that the heir to the Jack Kemp legacy is Paul Ryan. He is dealing in a different universe. That is the question of the challenge to America if we don't control these entitlement programs. But as he talks about it, he talks about a growth policy that has to be a part of it. If you listen to Paul Ryan's language, it is Kemp-esque in that it is very inclusive, it is inviting, it is not offensive, but it is challenging. And Jack challenged us too. And so, you know, Jack was unique. There's not going to be another Jack Kemp. But in terms of his openness and his belief that he can persuade anyone and everyone to his position, Paul Ryan has that same tenacity and intelligence, and frankly, we need to deal with that issue right now.
Okay, thank you so much, panel, and we'll break for lunch and return. Thank you.
Thanks, Morton.